We'll get back to your story about the Red Scarf Girl story tomorrow because it's a little difficult to do that right now. So here we go. We're going to talk about the Cold War heating up today, and here's your quick intro. In World War II, China fought on the side of the victorious Allies, but the victory proved to be kind of hollow for China. During the war, Japan's armies had occupied and devastated most of China's cities. China's civilian death toll alone was estimated between 10 and 22 million people. This vast country suffered casualties second only to those of the Soviet Union. However, conflict did not end with the defeat of the Japanese. In 1945, opposing Chinese armies faced one another. You're going to be Chiang Kai-shek, Mao, who you already know, a guy named Zhou Enlai, and Douglas MacArthur in this section. Over here, this is Chiang Kai-shek, highly westernized. If you take a look at this photograph, you'll see it's a nice mix of Western. Look at this tea set, for example, scones. Obviously, his wife over here, she was actually educated in Princeton, spoke English fairly well, and she's got a mix of Western-style dress here and Chinese influence. So Chiang Kai-shek is a friend of the United States, and his wife is not only a friend of the United States, but she actually has a thing for Wendell Willkie, who is an American politician. However, they're at odds with Mao, who you already know a little bit about, who loved to swim, loved green apples, and here's a little bit more about him.
So you shaved the mustache, me from the past. So the 20th century was pretty big for China because it saw not one but two revolutions. China's 1911 revolution might be a bigger deal from a world historical perspective than the more famous communist revolution of 1949, but you wouldn't know it because one, China's communism became a really big deal during the Cold War, and two, Mao Zedong, the father of communist China, was really good at self-promotion. Like, you know, his famous book of sayings, pretty much everyone in China just had to own it. And I mean had to.
Nationalist versus communist. So, shortly after the Japanese lose World War II, China goes back to fighting against itself. And there were two sides in this Chinese conflict. The nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who you just met, and the communists who are now led by Mao, or who will be led by Mao. Under the leader of Mao Zedong, the communists had strongholds in parts of China, specifically in northwestern part of China. From there, they mobilized peasants for guerrilla war against the Japanese in the northeast, and thanks to their efforts to promote literacy and improve food production, the communists won the peasants' loyalty. By 1945, they controlled much of northern China, at least. Meanwhile, the national forces of a guy named Jiang Jixi dominated southwestern China. He was protected from the Japanese by really rugged mountain ranges. Jiang gathered an army of about 2.5 million men, and from 1942 to 1945, the United States sent nationalists at least $1.5 billion in aid to fight against the Japanese. Instead of benefiting the army, however, these supplies and money often ended up in the hands of a few corrupt officers. Jiang's army finally fought few battles against the Japanese, and instead the Nationalist Army saved its strength for the coming battles against Mao's Red Army. After Japan surrendered, the Nationalists and Communists resumed fighting. The renewed Civil War lasted from 1946 to 1949, and at first the Nationalists had an advantage. Their army outnumbered the Communist army as much as 3-1, and the United States continued to support by providing nearly $2 billion additional in aid. The nationalist forces, however, did little to win popular support. With China's economy collapsing, thousands of nationalist soldiers deserted to the communists, and in the spring of 1949, China's major cities fell to the well-trained Red forces. Mao's troops were also enthusiastic about his promise to return land to peasants. The remnants of Jiang's army fled south, and in October of 1949, Mao gained control of the country. He proclaimed it the People's Republic of China. Jiang and other nationalist leaders retreated to the island of Taiwan, which Westerners called Formosa. Mao Zedong's victory fueled U.S. anti-communist feelings. Those feelings only grew after the Chinese and Soviets signed a treaty of friendship in 1950. Most people in the United States viewed the takeover of China as another step in the communist campaign to conquer the world. One of the other things that Mao did to gain the support of the peasants was he was part of a long march. So during the Civil War, Mao's forces, you can see in this map here, Mao's forces, he wasn't actually the leader of those forces, but he was part of these forces, tried to skirt the outside edges of the nationalist forces, trying to move from one section of China to another. And they went on this very, very long march, which they have said is much longer than it actually is, but it still was a very long march. A lot of people didn't survive the march, but Mao was one of them that did. And as a result, he gained some fame, kind of becomes a hero. This article is about two, I believe they're teachers, actually, that decided to recreate the Long March and test to see if it really was as long as they said it was. And here's their findings. It took 384 days. It wasn't as long as people had said it was, but it was still significantly long. And it was difficult. There we go. So by 1949, the communists have created the People's Republic of China. And since the United States had just created a foreign policy of containment, where they were going to try to just contain communism by spending a whole lot of money in countries where communism hadn't spread to and try to kind of manipulate people into not wanting to turn communist. Because they had spent a lot of money trying to contain communism, for example, just in China they'd spent $3 billion on Kai-shek and Jiang Ziqi. So when China falls to communism, it looks as if America's foreign policy has absolutely failed. And since the United States wasn't used to losing wars, losing kind of conflicts, the American public was really stunned because containment had been tested and failed. And not just failed, but failed in a massive way because China was the largest, most populated country. Well, maybe not the largest mass, but the largest populated, had the largest population in the world at the time, and anyway, it had failed to control the spread of communism. Okay, here's Mao. He loved to swim.
You are a sad, strange little man.
Loved green apples. Had bad teeth, and that's okay.
And the alliance fell apart in 1927 when Kuomintang leader Kai-shek got mad at the communists for trying to foment socialist revolution, to which the communists were like, but that's what we do, man. We're communists. Anyway, this turned out to be a bad breakup for a bunch of reasons, but mainly because it started a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. We're not going to get into exhausting detail about the Civil War, but spoiler alert, the communists won. There are a few things to point out. First, even though Mao emerged victorious, he and the communists were almost wiped out in 1934, except that they made a miraculous and harrowing escape, trekking from southern China to the mountains in the north in what has become famously known as the Long March, a great example of historians missing an opportunity since it could easily have been called the Long Ass March as it featured donkeys. Second, for much of the time that Kuomintang was trying to crush the CCP, significant portions of China were being occupied and or invaded by Japan. Thirdly, the communists were just better at fighting the Japanese than the nationalists were, in spite of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek had extensive support from the U.S. And each time the nationalists failed against the Japanese, their prestige among their fellow Chinese diminished. And it wasn't helped by nationalist corruption or the collection of onerous taxes from peasants, or stories about nationalist troops putting on civilian clothing and abandoning the city of Nanking during its awful destruction by the Japanese army in 1937. Meanwhile, the communists were winning over the peasants in their northwestern enclave by making sure that troops didn't pillage local land and giving peasants a greater say in local government. Now, that isn't to say that everything was rosy under Mao's communist leadership, even at its earliest stages. By the way, that is an actual chalk illustration. Very impressive. past. In a preview of things to come, in 1942, Mao initiated a rectification program, which basically meant students and intellectuals were sent down into the countryside to give them a taste of what real China was like in an effort to re-educate them. We try to be politically neutral here on Crash Course, but we are always opposed to intellectuals doing hard labor. But anyway, within 4 years of the end of World War II, the communists routed Chiang Kai-shek's army and sent them off to Taiwan, and these military victories paved the way for Mao to declare the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. So once in power, Mao and the PRC were faced with the task of creating a new socialist state. And Mao declared early on that the working class in China would be the leaders of a people's democratic dictatorship. Oh, democratic dictatorships, you're the best.
Okay, so back to business. So this renewed civil war had broken out, and the United States really wanted Chiang Kai-shek, who was also known as Jiang Shishi, to win because he was westernized, right, and had a wife who'd been educated in Princeton. So China was now kind of split. We sent a lot of aid to the nationalists, but at the end of the day, it looked like the communist forces were going to be victorious, and so the nationalists flee to the island of Taiwan. So here is Taiwan, also known as AKA Formosa. Today, this is a big deal. The recognition of Taiwan is a big deal in the United Nations. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So they flee to Taiwan.
Run, Forrest, run!
And the communists stay behind in the mainland of China and create the People's Republic of China, which is now going to be communist. Okay. Now here's kind of, here's a little bit of background. So China is now split into two nations. One was the island of Taiwan, which was also called Nationalist China, and it has an area of about 13,000 square miles. The mainland of the People's Republic of China had an area of more than 3.5 million square miles. So now the existence of two Chinas and the conflicting international loyalties they inspired intensified the Cold War, because the United States, despite it not being practical, is going to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan, even though it doesn't seem to really be practical, given that Mao controls, a much larger population and portion of the mainland part of China. Okay. So after Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, the United States helped him set up the government there on that small island. It was called the Republic of China. The Soviets gave financial, military, and technical aid to Mao in communist China. In addition, the Chinese and the Soviets pledged to come to each other's defense if either was attacked. So now, while the United States is kind of creating NATO, right? Remember NATO, 1949. Now you have the Chinese and the Soviets pledging a mutual kind of defense pact with each other as well. So the United States tried to halt the Soviet expansion into Asia. For example, when Soviet forces occupied the northern half of Korea after World War II and set up a communist government there, the United States supported a separate state in the south. In the early years of Mao's reign, Chinese troops expanded into Tibet, into India, and southern or inner Mongolia. Northern or outer Mongolia, which bordered the Soviet Union, remained in the Soviet sphere. In a brutal assault in 1950-1951, China took control of Tibet. The Chinese promised autonomy to Tibetans who followed their religious leader, the Dalai Lama. When China's control over Tibet tightened in the late 1950s, the Dalai Lama fled to India. India welcomed many Tibetan refugees after the failed revolt in Tibet in 1959, and as a result, the resentment between India and China grew. In 1962, they are going to clash over the two countries' unclear border. The fighting stopped, but there still continues to be resentment there today. Okay. Marshall Plan. Hang on. Okay, so 60 seconds of Mao and how the communists transformed China. So for decades, China had been in turmoil, engaged in civil war, fighting with Japan. When the communists took over, they moved rapidly to strengthen their rule over China's 550 million people. After taking control of China, the communists began to tighten their hold. The party's 4.5 million members made up just 1% of the population, but they were disciplined. Like the Soviets, the Chinese communists set up two parallel organizations, the Communist Party and the national government, and Mao headed both of them until 1959. Mao was determined to reshape China's economy based on Marxist socialism. 80% of the people lived in rural areas, but most owned no land. Instead, 10% of the rural population controlled 70% of the farmland. Mao seized the holdings of the landlords. His forces killed more than 1 million of them. He then divided the land among peasants. And later, to further Mao's socialist principles, the government forced peasants to join collective farms, and each of these comprised of 2